ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Zombie Train. I am your host, Ellis, otherwise known as Train Man, and this is episode 297. This week, we have questions from 2716 Productions, back on episode 230, about cab forwards and some other SP engines. The exact wording goes, what did the Zombie Train have in correlation with the SP cab forwards, specifically the AC-9 and the AC-12s, as well as MK5 Mikados and P-10 Pacifics? It's funny that this episode follows last episode, in which I mentioned the AC-12 cab forward, the Survivor, the only surviving cab forward. And I did talk about what happened with that engine. Now, one of the issues with that engine that I didn't bring up during the last episode is the fact that the AC-12 was exclusively oil-fired, and there wasn't really a way to get around that. Because of the orientation of the tender and the engine and the cab and the firebox, it meant that when we ran that engine, we did have to use oil reserves, which were, well, few and far between, as you might figure. So it sort of turned us off to using that engine. It didn't get as much use as you would think. A lot of the other engines, which could be coal burners, which could be converted to coal burners, were used instead, and were used on, well, more open-air passes like Tennessee Pass or Donner Pass. And so, that's, the cab forward was pretty tied to the usage of the Moffett route, like I mentioned, and Moffett Tunnel, and, some other routes that had very long tunnels. That said, we did get away with a 5.5 mile long tunnel up on Marias Pass, so, I don't know, we got away with it. It was the kind of thing where we did have to prepare engineers for it. We weren't about to build new cab forwards, and that's where it brings me around, again, because of the difficulties in running them, and that's what brings me to the AC-9s. Now, you asked about the AC-9s. There were not any surviving AC-9 cab forwards. We did consider, at a time, building more cab forwards, but like I just said, again, because of the fuel issues, that wasn't a wise thing to do. The other idea that we had is sort of building a stack that would extend the length of the engine and, spit out fumes behind the cab. In the end, a lot of time, we just tried to look for engines that had an all-weather cab that we could do our best to seal, and also using gear that was, like gas masks and oxygen tanks and stuff like that, stuff that would keep an engineer and fireman from suffocating in the cab while you were going through these long tunnels. Also keep in mind that it didn't, it really didn't help anybody in the passenger cars, but, and we had to seal those up pretty tight as we went through. The other thing is, a lot of these long tunnels that had ventilation gear didn't have functioning ventilation gear after the Great Panic. For whatever reason, most of the time was just because of a lack of power. And some of them were kind of in the middle of nowhere or behind enemy lines, so to speak. So, that wasn't an option. It wasn't an option to keep them manned and keep them operating like that. It was a problem, and again, like I said, necessitated us using passes without many long tunnels, or without any long tunnels. So, also I mistakenly, I called out Donner Pass. Donner Pass is just not as bad, I don't think, as the Moffett route. It wasn't as much of a problem. I know that the cab forwards were built specifically for Donner Pass, but it was less of a hurdle than Moffett Tunnel for whatever reason. Let me check my track maps for a second. So, okay, that doesn't help me at all. Yeah, never mind. Sorry, what did I mean with Donner Pass? The other one, the Overland route, or I don't know. Anyway, I apologize if I misspoke. Let me move on to the other engines that we have. Or, well, yeah, the other engines. And again, this is a nice segue from last episode. Last episode, we talked about all the engines that are at the California State Railroad Museum, and again, one of them is the AC-12, the one surviving AC-12 cab forward. That got me thinking, okay, where are the other SP engines? Where are they? And they're sort of scattered all over the place, partly because they were so famous, with the GSs, and two of the other ones which were mentioned in this comment are the surviving, what is this, P5? Is it P? No, the P was Pacifics. This is an MK5. And the other one is the P10. The P10 was halfway through a rebuild that had been going on forever. And it was difficult to find where all the parts were because I didn't know who was redoing it. It's sort of sitting in a park, or wherever it is, or wherever it was, I should say. And all the parts for it were not, like, there with it. I don't know. I just remember going there and going, wow, where's the rest of this engine? The tender wasn't even with it, it was on this little stretch of track that was totally isolated. It was, like, surrounded by basically scaffolding, which was kind of ridiculous. Although, thankfully, it was on its drive wheels. I was understanding that that was a relatively new thing. And, yeah, it was halfway through this rebuild. They'd gotten a lot of work done, but there was still a long, long way to go. Compare this to the MK5, which was actually operating in New Orleans, or, well, thereabouts, nearby. And, well, that got hit by firefall pretty bad, so we did have to do some work on it, but it was in a much better place than the P10. SP engines in general were kind of a mixed bag. I mean, obviously, because you have so many of them. But there were engines in fairly good repair, like 4449, of course, and there were engines that were in pretty tough, or pretty rough situations, like the P10. The cab forward, which really wasn't, nobody intended that to operate again, really. I mentioned previously the other GS that survives, the GS6, was in pretty rough condition, didn't really want to move. I don't know. I don't know what else to go with this. Now, the engines, aside from the cab forward, were pretty mid-size, at least these other two is what I mean. And so they were sort of roamers. I didn't really know what to do with them exactly, because, well, they needed conversions, first of all, which meant that they weren't great steamers. It also meant that they didn't have large capacities. That's the other issue with converting oil burners to coal burners. Aside from the fact that you have to then modify the firebox, there's the fact that you now have a tender that's suited for oil and is probably smaller than whatever tender, probably smaller than a tender that would carry a similarly potent amount of coal. Oil has a better energy density than coal does, so if you have a small tender, if you have oil, you might be able to get by, but coal would not get you as far. Also, the other issue is then you have to modify the tender too. You can't just throw coal into an oil, bunker, I guess, and expect it to work. You have to cut out a hole for it, etc., and you have to sort of... there's a lot of modifications you have to do. That was the biggest problem with SP engines for us, was the fact that they were all oil burners. And it didn't come as a surprise, but it certainly came as an annoyance. This is, for those who don't remember, oil has to be refined, and in order to do that, you need a certain amount of infrastructure. And that wasn't something that we had. And we didn't really have the know-how to deal with it either. In fact, it was difficult to find someone that did. And in the end, we ended up finding some people, but they were overseas, and we had to bring them back. And that was a whole thing in and of itself. And then finally we had oil. But that didn't enable us to run oil burners. That enabled us to run diesels. And also it made the military very happy because they could finally run the rest of their ships that weren't nuclear powered. That said, they did have a lot of ships that were nuclear powered. Again, as you might figure, most of them are submarines. And then a handful of them are carriers. As for nuclear powered ships, though, they were not the only ones that had them. The other nuclear powered ships were in Russian hands, aside from submarines, which the Russians had as well. Russia in general was not in a great place because of a lot of internal turmoil, but they did organize themselves into a fighting force and did their thing. But that's not, if you want to learn more about that, I encourage you all to read the book about these events, World War Z by Max Brooks. And yeah, so they were operating a fleet of mostly carriers, with not a lot of teeth, so to speak, because you didn't have the fuel for planes. They were operating the D Corps, which was the dirigible corps. Relatively easy to deal with, although they still use refined fuel. They don't use as much of it because they don't use it to stay aloft. They stay aloft via hydrogen or helium. Helium being in short supply, by the way, because we had a strategic reserve of it before World War Z, and then you sort of go through that a lot quicker than you expect to, and getting it is not easy, because helium is a byproduct of fusion, which is not something that we can readily do. It also is a product of radioactive decay, which is something that just sort of happens over time, but you still need to capture it. Helium being so light, it tends to float to the top of the atmosphere and then get blown away by the solar wind. This is your science lesson for the day. So keeping us stocked with helium was an issue that we didn't really consider at first, and it was a lot more difficult than you might think. Helium was, in general, just a pain to come by because of those factors. Yeah. Hydrogen would have been easy to come by, but there were obviously problems with that. Some of the D Corps did use hydrogen. Thankfully, there were no catastrophes that stemmed from that, but in general, people wanted to be safe and remember the Hindenburg and not use hydrogen as a lifting gas because of the issues that it had. Speaking of hydrogen, there were times where we figured we could possibly use hydrogen as an alternate fuel instead of refined crude oil, but the process to create hydrogen gas is energy intensive, and that was not something that we could spend the power on. We needed the power for many other things, mostly like machine shops and stuff like that. So yeah, that went out the window. We did try a number of alternative fuels. One of them was this highly experimental thing that had been sort of come up with at some point during the war. I don't know exactly where the idea came from, but it was like these fuel cubes, which were made from crude oil, which worked, sort of, but they didn't really solve our problems. Because, again, the main problem with using coal was the fact that now it was difficult to transport and had less energy density. It solved the energy density issue, but it didn't really make using coal any easier because... Or it wasn't really any easier than using coal because now you had to not only get the crude oil and turn it into this, which again took a lot of power and sort of chemical engineering, which wasn't something that we were very good at. Then you still had all the other logistical issues with coal in terms of using it in steam engines. If there had been some sort of miracle fuel that we could use in oil-burning engines, that would be great. But anyways, if you got any questions, see you next week. Trainman out.